Hello mga ka-investor, welcome back sa ating channel. At ngayon, pag-uusapan natin itong soft landing. No? So, isa tong video na kung saan mag-react tayo. So, mag-react lang tayo kung saan magagamit natin to. Kasi as Pilipino, pwede rin natin magamit to. Yung America is a global market. So, kung anong mangyayari sa Amerika, makaka-apekto sa Pilipinas. No? So, may konting pagkakaiba lang, pero panoorin natin to. So yung term na soft landing, ibig sabihin lang nito is hindi magkakaroon ng recession. So mamaya ipopost-post ko yung video kung magko-comment tayo, no? Magko-comment ako sa mga bagay-bagay dito. So i-start ko na yung video at panoorin na natin.
A percentage point. I need a 12-month pause at 5%. At the time, the media was filled with optimism about something called a soft landing. The reason this term soft landing exists is simply because of this chart. It shows the US central bank's interest rate, and it also shows that almost every time they raise their interest rate, it triggers an economic recession, as you see marked by these gray bars. Now, in some cases, they raise their interest rate, but no recession occurs. These are the famous soft landings, the most recent one occurring in 1995, 30 years ago. But in September 2007, people thought it was happening again. When the Federal Reserve began to cut its interest rate, there wasn't any clear sign of a recession. People were starting to get very excited about the possibility of the economy avoiding a recession. Of course, we now know in hindsight that this optimism was premature because the US economy did slide into a recession shortly afterwards. Fast forward to today, and it's easy.
So, kung mare-recall niyo yung sabi doon, noong 2007, nag-cut ng interest rate yung Federal Reserve, and then, alam niyo yung nangyari, di ba? Next year, 2008, yung Great Financial Crisis, yung about sa mortgage, na kung saan talagang meltdown yung buong, stock market or buong mundo. So, kung matatandaan nyo, kung nag-start ako dito, November 2023, sinimulan ko yung crypto portfolio, Philippine stock portfolio, tsaka US stock portfolio na kung saan dinadocument natin yung pag-i-invest natin. Kung maaalala nyo, lagi kong binabanggit yung Federal Reserve Rate or Fed Fund Rate. Ito yon kasi isa tong macro indicator na kung saan nakaka-apekto to sa lahat ng bagay. Okay, so ang Federal Funds, ito lang yung parang pag-uutang ka, ito yung term na yon. Kumbaga, 3%, 5% yon. Kumbaga sa global, ito yung global scale. So, as of right now, 4.75. Galing siya ng 5.5, 5.25 to 5.5 sa Amerika yon. Which nagdeduct sila ng 0.5. Napakalaking bagay, no? So, ibig sabihin, kung pinanood niyo yung kanina, sabi doon, majority ng pag nagkakat na ng interest rate, doon na nagsisimula yung recession, no? So, ayun, panoorin natin.
To see a few similarities. The Fed has also ended a year-long pause of interest rates at 5% by deciding to cut its interest rate by half a percentage point at its September meeting. And once again, talk of a soft landing is everywhere.
Soft landing. A soft landing. Soft landing.
A soft landing.
The number of news articles mentioning this term hit an all-time high a few months ago, and we see that this was indeed also the case before the 2001 recession and before the financial crisis in 2008. Today, the media is once again hopeful that the Federal Reserve is achieving a soft landing this time around. But as we can see from this chart, news outlets don't have the greatest track record. As we just discussed, the only time a soft landing actually occurred in the last 30 years of data was in 1995. So the question today is whether we're seeing the Federal Reserve pull off another 1995. When we look at economic growth in the United States, we see that it's been very resilient at the higher interest rates. GDP growth in the US currently stands at 3%. That's higher than the level of economic growth there was before the pandemic. That's definitely not the type of growth rate you see during recessions, where GDP actually often goes negative. In fact, in 1995, we see there were similar levels of growth to what the US is experiencing today. So at a first glance, things are looking good for the possibility of a soft landing. But there are three big differences between today and the 1995 soft landing that we need to look at. Firstly, the job market today could be weaker than it was in 1995. A recession indicator called the SOM rule has triggered in 2024. This is the SOM rule recession indicator. We've made a video going in depth into why it's important, but it basically shows us the momentum of the unemployment rate. It states that when the momentum begins to pick up, this means the economy is heading into a recession. More specifically, when this indicator crosses above 0.5%, it signals that the economy is either heading into a recession or already in one. We see that in 1995, we had no such development occur. Today, we do. However, many experts believe that the recent pickup in the unemployment rate is being driven by immigration, not necessarily by people getting laid off. After all, the unemployment rate is a percentage. So if more people are coming into the country, that can lead the unemployment rate to rise without necessarily seeing the number of unemployed people growing. Indeed, we see that while the growth of the workforce in the United States has remained at a low 1%, foreign-born workers are growing at a very rapid 4.4%. So the US is effectively seeing record growth of its population, which could be skewing the data on the unemployment rate. In fact, the creator of this SOM rule, Claudia Sahm, has said herself recently that her rule may not work this time around. She wrote an article for Bloomberg explaining that even though the rule has triggered, she doesn't think the US is currently in a recession. However, there is another key difference between 2024 and 1995. The Fed has cut interest rates by 50 basis points in 2024. In 1995, they cut by 25 basis points. Now that may not sound very important, but in the past, it has made the difference between soft and hard landings. In 2007, they cut by 50 basis points. A recession followed. In 2001, they cut by 50 basis points. A recession followed. In 1995 and 1998, they cut by 25 basis points. No recession followed. The reason this relationship exists is because larger rate cuts usually mean bigger problems in the economy than a smaller cut. Now, it could be that 2024...
Ayan, so, ipopost ko muna. So, ayun mga ka-investor, kung napansin ninyo, yung 50 basis point, di ba? Maliit na bagay lang siya, pero kung babalikan mo, ayan, sabi 2024, 2007, 2001, sabi dito sa tatlong to, na kung saan 2001, 2007, nung nag-cut sila ng 50 basis points, ibig sabihin, the bigger the cut, the bigger the Federal Reserve cut, the bigger the problem. So hindi may laging effect eh. Hindi natin agad nararamdaman 'yon. Pero isa itong indicator. So kaya like ko sinasabi sa pagdating sa US stock, mag-ingat kasi sobrang taas. Kumbaga hindi siya worth it mag-invest as of right now. Okay, siguro ng 2022 kung nakabili kayo ng Tesla, ng Coinbase, ng especially Facebook. Napakaganda ng Facebook kasi umabot siya ng halos less than 100, umabot ng 90. Tapos ngayon nasa 500 na yung presyo niya, times 5 yung pera mo. Tesla as well, umabot yata siya ng 100 kung bumalik ng 200 plus, almost 300. 'Di ba? So kung doon kayo nakapag-invest 2022, ang ganda. Pero dahil sinimulan na rin natin yung video natin ng 2023, November pa, yun, medyo hindi tayo nakabili. So, ayun, ingat kayo sa stock market sa US. So, balik ko na dito.
Ends up being an exception to this rule and becomes the first example where a 50 basis point cut is not followed by a recession. But that brings us to one final key difference: inflation. Unless you've been living under a rock, you're probably aware that the world has been experiencing quite a bit of inflation recently. Whether we're looking at the United States, Canada, or Germany, most developed economies saw their inflation levels reach 30-year highs. And these high levels of inflation have been the main reason for why the Federal Reserve has actually raised its interest rate in the first place, with the aim to get inflation back down to their 2% target. Now, as you can see, they've managed to get inflation down to much more reasonable levels as a result of these higher interest rates. But it would be the first time in history that the Fed managed to do this without triggering a recession. When we zoom out a little bit, we see that every single time inflation has surged above 5%, a recession has materialized. In 1995, inflation was not a problem. And the fact that inflation was not a problem likely made it easier for the Federal Reserve to avoid a recession back then. Today, the Fed is effectively attempting to do something that it has never done before: bring inflation down without triggering a recession. In order for the Fed to truly achieve a soft landing, they need to not only avoid a recession, but also avoid seeing inflation begin to move back up. So far, we can say that they've been successful. This has led the US stock market index, the S&P 500, to soar to new all-time highs consistently throughout 2024. This is something that stocks also did back in the 1995 soft landing. So the stock market certainly seems to believe in the possibility of a soft landing. If 1995 is any example, a true soft landing could potentially see the S&P 500 move a lot higher. A shift in economic data that begins pointing towards a recession, however, could lead to a violent wake-up call for US stocks.
So, ayun, mga ka-investor, ang masasabi ko lang doon before natin i-end yung video is once tumaas yung inflation, automatic, ibabalik nila yung interest rate pataas. Ang mangyayari, lower valuation na magka-crash yung stock market. So, magbibigay tayo ng ibang explanation dyan sa different video, pero ang masasabi ko lang kung nasa US stocks kayo nag-invest ngayon, mag-ingat kayo. Okay? Dahil sobrang laki ng chance magkaroon ng recession. Okay? So, salamat sa panonood and yun, mas maganda maging aware din kayo sa macroeconomics. Hindi lang puro individual stock ang titignan nyo. Kailangan tignan nyo rin yung broader picture kung ano nangyayari sa global economy. And salamat sa panonood mga ka-investor and bye for now.